stood in my living room, watching my 3 children sit down together, something that hadn't happened in years, and I knew before anyone spoke that whatever came next would break me. "Mom," Stephen said, his voice careful, rehearsed. "We've arranged a place for you. A good nursing home. You'll be better there." I nodded. I didn't cry. I packed my suitcase that same afternoon while the winter sun made long shadows across the floor, and I thought about all the years I'd spent believing that loving your children meant they'd love you back the same way. I was wrong about so many things. But this story isn't about what I thought would happen. It's about what actually did. And if you stay with me until the end, you'll understand why I'm telling you this now. Please, if you have a moment, subscribe to this channel. We're just starting out, and every day we'll share new stories that matter. Stories like mine. My name is Eleanor Brooks, and I'm 72 years old. Most of those years I spent believing that a mother's greatest wealth was her children. I learned, in the bitterest way possible, that to mine, I was just another bill they didn't want to pay anymore. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon. One of those quiet ones, with weak winter sunlight coming through the living room window, drawing little squares of dust dancing in the air. I was brewing coffee, breathing in that smell that always reminded me of when the house was full, when they all still came home. Then they arrived. All 3 of them together, which was already a miracle. Stephen, my oldest, 50 years old now, his forehead already marked by worries that never had anything to do with me. Claire, the middle one, 47, always trying to please everyone, and ending up pleasing no one, least of all herself. And Jason, my youngest at 42, who to me had never stopped being the boy I needed to protect from the world. They sat on the couch. I brought coffee. Nobody touched it. "Mom, we need to talk," Stephen started. His tone was the one he used in business meetings. Professional, distant. I sat in the armchair across from them and folded my hands in my lap. My wedding ring, too loose now, turned around my finger. I'd lost weight that year. Grief has a way of eating you from the inside. "We've been talking," Claire added, looking at Stephen instead of me, "and we think it's time." "Time for what?" I asked, though somewhere deep I already knew. "Time for you to have proper care," Jason said. His voice was softer, but his eyes were on the floor. "Somewhere with people your age, activities, nurses." The word hung in the air like smoke. Nurses. "You're putting me in a home," I said. Not a question. "It's a very nice facility," Stephen said quickly. "We've already toured it. They have gardens, a library, movie nights." "I have a garden," I said. "I have books. I have a TV." "Mom," Claire's voice cracked just slightly. "You're alone here. What if something happens? What if you fall? I'm 72, not 92. I can take care of myself." "Can you?" Stephen's question came out sharper than he meant it to. "Because last month you forgot to pay the electric bill. And the month before that, Mrs. Henderson said she found you in the yard at 2 a.m. "I couldn't sleep," I said. "I was looking at the stars. In your nightgown. In December." The room went quiet except for the soft hiss of the radiator. Outside, a car passed, its tires crunching on the cold street. "When?" I asked. "Friday," Stephen said. "We'll help you pack. That's 3 days. We've already paid the first month." I looked at each of them. Stephen, so much like his father. Proud, certain, always knowing what was best. Claire, who'd inherited my eyes but not my courage. Jason, who still bit his thumbnail when he was nervous, just like he did when he was 7. "All right," I said. They seemed surprised. Maybe they'd expected me to fight, to cry, to beg. But I'd learned long ago that you can't make people love you the way you need them to. You can only love them and hope it's enough. It wasn't. Sunrise Valley wasn't the worst place they could have chosen. The building was clean, modern, with big windows that let in too much light. Everything smelled like disinfectant and overcooked vegetables. The staff smiled with their mouths, but not their eyes. They'd seen 1,000 Eleanors before me. Women deposited by guilty children who visited less and less until they stopped coming altogether. My room was on the 2nd floor. Small. A bed, a dresser, a chair by the window. They let me bring some things. Photos, a few books, my mother's quilt. I arranged them carefully, trying to make the space feel like mine. It didn't work. The walls remained stubbornly institutional, a pale cream color that seemed designed to absorb personality, rather than welcome it. I hung my wedding photograph, a younger version of myself, radiant in white lace, my late husband's arm around my waist, and for the first time since arriving, I wept. That first night, I lay awake listening to the sounds of the facility, the humming of the ventilation system, a resident's television bleeding through the walls, an announcement over the intercom that no one needed at 3 a.m. Around 4 o'clock, I heard someone down the hall calling for help, their voice growing increasingly desperate. A nurse came, but slowly, and by then, the voice had changed from demanding to resigned. I pulled my mother's quilt up to my chin and understood that I was now one of them. We were all waiting, some of us for visitors, some of us for death, some of us had stopped knowing the difference. The other residents were kind enough, though kindness in a place like Sunrise Valley often felt like the kindness of people too familiar with disappointment to be shocked by anything. Martha was the first person I met who lived there, truly lived, not merely existed. She'd been a high school English teacher for 38 years and spent her days doing crossword puzzles in the common room, always in pen, never pencil. When I sat beside her that first week, I watched her solve a particularly difficult clue without hesitation. Melancholy, with "the," she said aloud to no one in particular. The blues, obviously. She filled it in with a flourish and turned to me. "Are you new?" When I nodded, she extended her hand formally. "Martha Whitmore. I used to teach, but they let me retire from that. Turns out I wasn't teaching anymore, just showing up." She smiled, and for the first time since Friday, I felt something that wasn't quite despair. George was harder to know. He was a veteran of the Korean War, though he'd long since forgotten which unit he served in, or the names of the men he served with. What he hadn't forgotten were 3 stories. One about a blizzard that nearly killed his entire platoon, one about a girl he was supposed to marry who married his best friend instead, and one about the day he came home to a country that didn't recognize what he'd done. He told these stories in order, rotating through them like a record with only 3 songs. When he finished the 3rd one, he'd pause, as if confused, and then he'd return to the beginning. By my 2nd week, I knew them all by heart. By my 4th week, I started sitting with him anyway, because sometimes when he was telling them, his eyes would focus on something real, something present, and he wouldn't be alone in the Korean winter anymore. Linda cried every afternoon at 4 o'clock. No one knew why. The staff had stopped asking. There was a kind of rhythm to it. She'd sit in the common room, usually by the window, and at precisely 4 o'clock her shoulders would begin to shake. She'd sit there for 5, sometimes 10 minutes, tears streaming silently down her face, and then it would stop, as if a switch had been turned off. One day I sat beside her and didn't ask anything. I just took her hand. She didn't pull away. The next day I came back, and the day after that. By the 3rd week, she was only crying for 3 minutes. By the 3rd month, she was dry-eyed, though her hand still gripped mine as if it were the only solid thing in a dissolving world. Robert was different. He'd been a jazz musician. Not famous, he was careful to clarify, but good enough to make a living in clubs in Boston during the 60s and 70s. He had emphysema now, so his playing days were over, but he hummed. All day long, he hummed. Coltrane, Miles Davis, Billie Holiday. He'd shuffle through the hallways in his slippers, trailing melodies like breadcrumbs, and you could follow his route through Sunrise Valley by sound alone. Stephen came the first Sunday after I arrived. He brought flowers, daisies, which I've never liked but had stopped telling anyone about decades ago, and stayed for exactly 30 minutes. He checked his watch twice. He told me about work, about his son's soccer games, about the new car he was thinking about buying. He didn't ask how I was sleeping, though my eyes were ringed with the particular darkness of the newly institutionalized. He didn't ask if I'd made any friends, or if I was adjusting, or if I was okay. When he left, he kissed my forehead and promised to visit again next week. He didn't. Claire came the 2nd week with homemade cookies that tasted like guilt. She'd made them too sweet, as if sugar could compensate for what she was compensating for. She cried a little, which made me comfort her, which I suppose was the point. "It's for the best, Mom," she said, her voice unsteady. "You'll see. You'll make friends here. People your age. As if people my age were a species I'd never encountered before. As if age was the problem and not abandonment." I told her the cookies were delicious. Jason didn't come at all for the first month. When he finally did, appearing on a gray Saturday afternoon as if the weather had shaped him. He looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. "Sorry," he said. "Work's been crazy." His work was IT support for a mid-sized insurance company. I knew this because I still read the emails he sent, still tried to understand the world he inhabited without me. He sat for 20 minutes, asked me twice how I was feeling, and never quite made eye contact. When he left, he said he'd call, but he didn't. Not for another 3 weeks. I told him it was fine. I told all of them it was fine. What else could I say? They were busy. They had their own lives. I was their mother, but I was also their past, and they were all trying to live in their present. I understood this, even as it destroyed something inside me. But here's what I didn't tell them. I'd made a decision that first night in Sunrise Valley, lying in that narrow bed, listening to someone down the hall calling for a nurse who never came fast enough, listening to the building settle around me like a slowly collapsing lung. I decided I wasn't going to be one of the ones who waited. I started small. The morning after Martha beat me at my first crossword puzzle, I volunteered in the library. It was really just a converted storage room with floor-to-ceiling shelves and a reading table, but it smelled like paper and possibility. The librarian, a woman named Susan, who visited twice a week, was delighted to have help. I began organizing the shelves, not just alphabetically but by category. I learned which residents couldn't read the small print anymore and moved those books to the labeled section for large print. I learned which ones had failing memory and started a familiar favorites section with books people recognized, books they'd read before and could sink into without the burden of plot. I joined the gardening club, though calling it a club was generous. It met on Tuesday and Thursday mornings and consisted of Mrs. Chen, no relation to Margaret, I'd later discover, who was 91 and had been a gardener in China for 6 decades, Tom, who liked being outdoors for the sunshine rather than the plants, and occasionally, when his daughter didn't visit and make him feel guilty about it, a man named Harris who'd been a botanist before a stroke took away his left side, but not his love of growing things. The garden was just a few raised beds in the courtyard with tomatoes, herbs, and some flowering plants the staff rotated with the seasons. But in those raised beds, something changed in me. I got dirt under my fingernails for the first time in 2 years. I felt the sun on my shoulders. Real sun, not filtered through window glass and guilt. I learned the names of plants I'd never bothered to learn before. Basil, oregano, thyme, sage, Mrs. Chen taught me that different herbs needed different amounts of water, that you had to listen to what the plants were telling you, and then she'd tap her temple with a smile that suggested she was talking about more than gardening. I began playing piano in the common room on Tuesday and Friday evenings. I was never good. My fingers were stiff, my memory for peace imperfect, but nobody minded. On the second evening, Robert appeared and started humming along. The residents gathered around. By the third week, it had become a kind of ritual. I'd play my mediocre renditions of Chopin and Beethoven. Robert would hum his jazz interpretations, and something almost beautiful would emerge from the collision. On Thursdays, I helped Linda fold laundry in the basement, which was a damp, windowless space that smelled of detergent and industrial-sized machinery. It wasn't pleasant, but Linda started asking me to meet her there, and slowly, imperceptibly, she stopped crying at 4 o'clock. First, it was just 5 minutes of dry eyes, then 10. Then she'd remember why she'd been crying in the first place, and explain haltingly that her late husband had used to help her fold the laundry on Thursday afternoons, that they'd turn it into a kind of dance, him tossing her socks to fold, and her laughing at his aim, that she'd forgotten, after he died, that memories could be this bittersweet thing, painful because they existed, yes, but also a kind of proof that the love had been real. I made myself useful, necessary even, not because I needed to feel important, though I desperately did, but because I needed to feel human. I needed to be more than a room number and a birth date on a medical chart. I needed to prove, to myself if not to anyone else, that placing me in Sunrise Valley hadn't been the end of my story. It was just a different chapter, and I got to decide what happened in it. And I wrote letters, long ones, to my children, telling them about my days, about Martha's latest crossword triumph, the New York Times Sunday puzzle, solved entirely in pen in 45 minutes, about the robin that nested in the garden courtyard, returning every spring even though the nest was destroyed each winter. About the new resident, Robert, who'd been a jazz musician and sometimes hummed Coltrane while he shuffled down the hallway, and how his music had changed something in me, made me believe that beauty could exist in small, unexpected moments. I didn't mail the letters. I kept them in a box under my bed, these elaborate fictions where I was fine, where I'd adjusted beautifully, where I was thriving. I wrote them anyway. Every Sunday evening, I'd sit at the small desk in my room and pretend to tell my children the truth, while creating instead a version of events that might be more palatable, more forgivable, less like abandonment, and more like a natural transition in our family's trajectory. 3 months passed, then 6. The visits became less frequent. Stephen came once a month, always on Sunday, always for 30 minutes, though now he sometimes brought his son, my grandson Michael, who was 8 and polite in the way of children who'd been trained to be polite toward elderly relatives. We'd sit in the common room, and Michael would show me things on his iPad, videos of soccer games, photos from school, while I tried to pretend I understood the technology and the world he lived in. He was a good boy, but he was a stranger. My grandchild and a stranger. Claire sent cards, beautiful ones, from artists she found online, with handwritten notes that said things like, "Thinking of you," and "Hope you're having a good week." They came regularly on Thursdays, which I eventually figured out meant she'd set up some kind of automated system. The consistency was touching in its way, and heartbreaking in another. Jason called occasionally, his voice distant, distracted. He was dating someone, he mentioned once. A woman named Amanda who worked in marketing. "She's great, Mom. You'd like her." I probably would have. I probably would have been grateful that he was happy, that at least something in his life was uncomplicated. He promised to visit but didn't, and eventually I stopped expecting him to. I told myself it was okay. I told myself they had their own lives, their own worries, their own patterns to navigate. I told myself a lot of things that probably weren't true, and over time something shifted. The pain didn't disappear, but it calcified. It became part of the landscape of my life, rather than something happening to me. I was sad about my children, the same way I was sad about the rain, or happy about the sunshine, as just another element of existence, neither requiring my particular attention, nor deserving my particular rage. Then one afternoon in spring, almost a year after I'd arrived, I was in the garden pulling weeds from around the tomato plants, when I heard a voice I hadn't heard in decades. "Eleanor?" I looked up, shading my eyes against the sun. A woman stood at the edge of the garden, older but unmistakable. Margaret Chen. We'd been neighbors 40 years ago, before she moved to California, before life took us in different directions, and neither of us had been brave enough to maintain the friendship that required effort across distance. "Margaret?" I stood, brushing dirt from my knees, and for a moment I wasn't sure if I should be embarrassed or relieved. "What are you doing here?" "My mother," she said, gesturing toward the building. "She's been here for 2 years. I'm visiting from San Francisco." I was walking past and I thought. She stopped, her eyes studying my face as if reading a text she'd forgotten she knew. "I thought that was you." I'd recognize those hands anywhere, still covered in dirt, still looking like they belonged to someone with something to do. We sat on a bench near the garden, and she told me about her mother, who was in advanced Parkinson's and no longer spoke, but still knew Margaret when she visited, still reached for her hand. She told me about her life in San Francisco, about the architecture firm she'd founded in the 80s, about her wife Susan and their 2 adult children, about the grandchildren who didn't quite understand why grandmother lived so far away in California, and then carefully, she asked about me. "My children thought it was best," I said, and the words tasted like ash in my mouth. "I came here almost a year ago. They visit sometimes. Less often now." She nodded. She didn't say the things people usually say, that they meant well, that it was hard to care for aging parents, that surely it was the right decision. Instead, she said, "That must hurt." And something inside me broke just a little, because yes, it hurt. It hurt in ways I'd been avoiding acknowledging, hurt that had become so familiar I'd almost forgotten it was there, the way you forget about a chronic pain until someone suddenly asks if you're okay, and you realize you're not. We talked for an hour. I told her about Martha and George and Linda and Robert. I told her about the garden and the piano, and the way I'd been trying to build a life inside this place that wasn't meant to be lived in, but survived. I told her about the letters I wrote and didn't send, about the decisions I'd made to matter, to be necessary, to be human in a place designed to make you feel less so. She listened the way you listen to someone you've known your whole life, with complete attention and no judgment. When I finished, she squeezed my hand and said, "I'm sorry I didn't keep in touch. After we both got so busy with our lives, I never called, never wrote. I should have." "People don't," I said. "That's how distance works. You intend to maintain things, and then you don't. And then one day you look up and decades have passed. That's not the story I want to tell," she said. "About us, about anything. I want to tell a different story." She promised to visit again before she flew back to California, and she did. She came the next day with coffee and magazines and her full attention. She came the day after that and brought her mother's photograph from her bag, a young woman in a qipao, standing in front of a garden that looked like the raised beds where we'd been weeding. She came again the following day, and each time we talked about real things, not the weather, not health updates, not the careful small talk that people use to maintain distance, but actual life, pain and disappointment, and the ways we survive them, loss and regret, and the ways we carry them forward. She told me about Susan's health scare 5 years ago, about the fear that had cracked open her entire understanding of what mattered. She told me about the daughter who didn't talk to them for 3 years after she came out as lesbian, and how learning to forgive your own child for their inability to understand you is a particular kind of grief. She told me about the times she wanted to call me and didn't, about the guilt of that, and how that guilt had prevented her from calling even more, because the guilt had become so heavy that acknowledging it felt like admitting she was a bad person. On her last day, she said, "Eleanor, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Are you okay? Really?" I thought about lying. I thought about saying yes, I'm fine, I'm adjusted, I've made peace with it, the way you do when people ask. But Margaret's eyes were kind, and I was so tired of pretending, so tired of the fiction that pain gets easier when you just allow enough time to pass. "No," I said, "I'm not." She squeezed my hand. "Then do something about it." "What can I do?" "They made a decision. I'm here. This is my life now. I can accept it or I can rage against it. But either way, I'm still here. You're Eleanor Brooks," she said, and there was steel in her voice that reminded me why we'd been friends all those years ago. The same woman who raised 3 children alone after your husband died. The same woman who went back to school at 45 to get her teaching certificate when everyone told you it was too late. The same woman who started your own small business tutoring students because you believed everyone deserved a chance to learn. You didn't give up then. Don't give up now. "I'm not giving up," I said. "I'm surviving." "Surviving isn't enough," she said. "You deserve more than survival. You deserve to actually live." After she left, back to San Francisco, back to her wife and her architecture, back to the life she'd built without me, I sat in my room and thought about what giving up meant and what not giving up might look like. If I gave up, I would continue to do what I'd been doing, making the best of things, creating a life within the confines of what I'd been given, finding meaning in small gestures and smaller victories. This was not nothing. This was a valid way to exist. But if I didn't give up, if I actually refused the narrative that had been handed to me, then I'd have to ask my children why they'd made this choice. I'd have to demand honesty instead of accepting their comfortable lies. I'd have to risk their disapproval and potential fury. I'd have to assert, clearly and unmistakably, that my life still belonged to me. It terrified me. I decided to do something I hadn't done in a year. I called Stephen. "Mom, is everything okay?" His voice was worried. I only called when something was wrong, when there was a problem that required his adult management. I'd trained them over decades to expect emergency from me, not intentionality. "I need to talk to you," I said. "All 3 of you, together." There was a pause. "Is it your health? Just come, please. This Saturday if you can." They came that Saturday. All 3 of them, looking nervous, probably thinking I was dying. Maybe they'd all rehearsed conversations about whether they should have left me at home, whether guilt was something they could have avoided. They sat in the small visiting room off the main lobby, an uncomfortable space designed for difficult conversations, with chairs that didn't match, and a table that wobbled. I'd asked the staff to give us privacy. Outside the window, the garden was blooming, tomatoes ripening on their vines like small promises, herbs growing wild and necessary. "What's going on, Mom?" Claire asked. Her hands twisted in her lap. She'd lost weight since I saw her last. Her marriage was probably struggling. Her daughter probably wasn't speaking to her. Our problems, I was learning, were often just variations on the same theme, being unable to love people the way they needed to be loved, no matter how hard we tried. I looked at them, my children, and I saw them for what they were, not villains in a story I'd written, not heroes of their own narrative, just people, tired, overwhelmed people who'd made a choice that seemed reasonable to them, though the reasonableness of it depended entirely on perspective. If you were them, tired of visiting an aging mother, worried about money and time and the erosion of your own lives, then placing me here made sense. If you were me, recently deposited and abandoned, then it felt like betrayal. I want to know why, I said. Why what? Stephen asked, already defensive. Why you put me here. The real reason. Not the story you told me, not the facility tour and the nice activities and the staff. The real reason. What were you actually afraid of? What were you actually trying to avoid? They looked at each other. Jason's thumbnail went to his mouth. I'd been right. He still did this when he was nervous. 42-year-old man with his thumb in his mouth like a boy. We told you, Stephen said. We thought it was best for you. No, I said, and I was surprised by the strength in my voice. You thought it was best for you, and I need to understand why. I need to actually understand. Not the sanitized version, but the truth. I'm your mother, and I'm asking you to tell me the truth. I think I deserve that much. The silence stretched. The building around us made its familiar sounds, the hum of the heating system, someone's television through a wall, the soft footsteps of a staff member in the hallway. Then Claire started crying, and once she started, she couldn't stop. I'm sorry, she gasped. I'm so sorry, Mom. I couldn't do it anymore. I couldn't watch you in that house alone. Couldn't watch you getting smaller and smaller. Every time I visited, you were thinner, quieter. You barely ate. You'd sit in Dad's chair and just stare at nothing. It was like watching you disappear. So you sent me away? So I didn't have to watch, she whispered. So I didn't have to be complicit in your slow disappearance. So I didn't have to feel like a terrible daughter because my own mother was slowly ceasing to exist, and I didn't know how to stop it. She took a shaky breath. And I was angry at you too. I was angry that you were taking so long to be okay after Dad died. I was angry that grief was so consuming in your life, that it had taken up so much space, and I felt guilty for being angry, and the guilt and anger combined into something I couldn't carry anymore. Stephen's jaw tightened. He looked away. It wasn't just that, he said slowly. Do you know how much it costs to maintain that house? The property taxes alone. The house is paid off, I said, but the upkeep, the utilities, the repairs, the roof needed work last year. The plumbing is original to 1982. And you weren't... He stopped, gathering words like they were dangerous. I wasn't what? You weren't using it, he said finally. 4 bedrooms for 1 person. A kitchen that could feed a family of 6. A living room where you sat alone. It felt like a waste. It felt like you were just occupying space, holding on to something that didn't serve you anymore. A waste. My home of 40 years. The place where I'd raised them, loved them, buried my dreams and built new ones. The place where I'd held my children when they had nightmares and taught them to ride bikes and made dinner every night and hosted holidays and created a life. A waste. That's all I was to you? I asked. A waste of resources? No, he said, and his voice cracked. No, but yes. I don't know. I was so angry, Mom. I was angry that after Dad died, you just checked out. You stopped calling. You stopped coming to things. You stopped being part of our lives, and we had to keep being part of yours. It felt unfair. It felt like you'd decided that grief was more important than your relationship with us. I felt something shift inside me. Anger, but also something else. Understanding, maybe. The recognition that grief, like love, is not a finite resource, and when we're drowning in it, we can't be expected to save anyone else. And you? I asked Jason. Why didn't you say anything? You're the youngest, but you're not a child. This was your mother. Why didn't you fight for me? He looked at me finally, his eyes red. Because I'm a coward, he said. Because Stephen and Claire decided and I went along with it. Because it was easier than fighting. Because I told myself they were right. That it was too much to expect of myself to care for you properly. that I was protecting you from being alone, but really I was just protecting myself from having to deal with it, from having to feel the weight of your pain alongside my own. I had my own problems, work stress, relationship issues, the feeling that I was a failure at basically everything, and adding your loneliness to my list felt impossible. The honesty stunned me. "Thank you," I said. "For what?" "For telling the truth." We sat there for a long time. The afternoon light shifted, painting the walls gold and rose, and I realized that this was what reconciliation actually looked like. Not forgiveness arriving suddenly like grace, but this slow, painful excavation of motive and fear, and all the ways we hurt each other, trying not to be hurt. "I'm not angry," I said finally. "Not anymore." I was. For months, I was so angry I could barely breathe. I'd lie awake at night imagining conversations where I told you exactly how much you'd hurt me. I wrote letters I never sent, practicing my rage, perfecting my accusations, but anger is exhausting, and I'm tired. I'm tired of being angry. "We can bring you home," Claire said suddenly. "If you want to come home, we can—" "No," I said. They stared. "You were right about some things," I said. "The house was too big. I was lonely. I was disappearing. I did need people around me. I did need a reason to get up in the morning that wasn't just habit or obligation, but you were wrong about this place. You thought you were putting me somewhere to die. Instead, you put me somewhere to live." I told them about Martha and George and Linda, about the garden and the library and the music, about Margaret's visit and what it taught me about the power of witness, the importance of someone seeing you as you actually are, not as a problem to be solved or a burden to be managed, about Robert humming Coltrane and how grief can be beautiful when it's not solitary. "I've made a life here," I said. "Not the life I wanted, but a life. And I've learned something you three need to hear." They leaned forward, and I saw in their faces the same hunger for wisdom I'd once felt when my own mother tried to tell me things about love and loss, things I was too young to understand. "You can't protect people from pain by causing them a different pain," I said. "You can't love someone by sending them away, and you can't make choices for other people's lives and call it kindness. That's just control dressed up in concern." Stephen looked down. Claire wiped her eyes. Jason's thumbnail found his mouth again, and I resisted the urge to take his hand and pull it away. "But," I said, and my voice gentled, "you can learn. You can do better. You can start now. Starting today. Starting this moment." "How?" Stephen asked. "By visiting. Not because you feel guilty, because you want to. By calling. Not to check if I'm alive, but to tell me about your lives. By letting me be part of your world instead of hiding me in mine. By seeing me, really seeing me, as someone who still has value, still has something to contribute, still has the capacity to love you even though you've hurt me. Can we?" Claire whispered. "After everything? Can you actually forgive us?" I reached across and took her hand. "Yes," I said, "we can. But not because forgiveness comes naturally, because forgiveness is a choice, and I choose to believe that you didn't intend to destroy me. You intended to solve a problem, and you solved it badly, but you solved it with love underneath, even if the love was confused and misguided. That conversation changed something. Not everything. There's no magic in real life, no perfect reconciliation where everyone hugs and the music swells and all the damage is suddenly undone, but it changed enough. Stephen started coming every other week instead of once a month, and he stayed longer. He brought his son Michael, who taught me how to play chess. I'm terrible at it. I make moves that violate every principle of the game, but Michael is patient in the way of children who are learning to be kind. We sit in the common room, the chessboard between us, and he explains strategy and sacrifice while I nod and make terrible choices. It's not about the chess. It's about the presence, the attention, the proof that I still exist in his world. Claire called every Tuesday evening at 7 o'clock, almost without fail. We talked about real things. Her marriage that was struggling because her husband worked too much, and they'd forgotten how to be intimate outside of task management. Her daughter who was thinking about college but hadn't been accepted to her first choice and was spiraling. Her fear that she'd wasted too much of her life trying to please people who didn't care enough to please her back. "You sound like me," I told her once. "I know," she said. "I'm trying to do better. I'm trying to be the person you've always been for me." "I'm not the person you think I am," I said. I'm just someone who's lived longer and made more mistakes and learned to accept that most of what we do doesn't work out the way we planned. But you keep trying, she said. That's what I mean. You keep living even when it would be easier to stop. Jason visited on Saturdays, sometimes with Amanda, sometimes without. He brought his guitar and played in the common room. The residents loved it. The way he played was careful and technical, not flashy, but genuine. He understood that music was a language for things we couldn't say, and he took that responsibility seriously. Especially Linda loved his music. After the third concert, she told me that his playing reminded her of her late husband, who'd played saxophone, that his rhythms matched the way her husband had moved through the world, steady and present, and somehow making everything around him more beautiful just by existing. He died 15 years ago, she said, and I've been so angry at him for leaving me. But listening to Jason play, I don't feel angry anymore. I feel grateful. I feel like the anger was taking up the space where gratitude could live. And I kept gardening, kept helping in the library, kept writing letters I didn't send. I made friends, real ones. Martha and I started a book club in the common room. We read widely and badly, mixing literary fiction with mysteries, poetry with romance, always with strong opinions and genuine engagement. We had arguments about plot and character, about theme and meaning. We assigned books to people based on who we thought needed them. Martha gave Linda Amor Towles' The Lincoln Highway, because she said it was about how people can surprise you and save you even when you're not looking for salvation. She gave George a biography of a Korean War general, because she thought understanding the institutional framework of his trauma might help him see himself differently. She gave Robert a book about the history of jazz. We were all reading towards something, even if we couldn't name it. George taught me poker, which I hated at first because I'm terrible at bluffing, at understanding probability, at making decisions with incomplete information. But slowly I learned that poker, like life, is mostly about reading people and taking calculated risks and knowing when to fold. George would laugh, a real laugh, not the hollow sound he made most of the time. When I'd make an impulsive bet that made no logical sense but accidentally worked out. That's not strategy, Eleanor, he'd say. That's blind luck. I'd tell him that blind luck had gotten me through 70 years, so I'd take what I could get. Robert and I developed a kind of partnership. He'd hum Coltrane while I played piano, and we'd create something almost beautiful from the collision of our two arts. He told me that his wife, who died in 1993, used to paint while he played, that she'd create color and form in response to sound, that their art had been in conversation. I've been humming her paintings for 30 years, he said. Ever since she died, I've been trying to reproduce the colors she made. But maybe I was missing the point. Maybe the point isn't to recreate what was lost, but to create something new that honors what was. 2 years after my children brought me to Sunrise Valley, I stood in that same garden on a spring afternoon, my hands in the dirt, the sun warm on my shoulders in a way that felt like forgiveness. Stephen was visiting. It was a Saturday, not a Sunday, which meant he'd chosen this time rather than organizing his life around obligation. He knelt beside me, carefully, his suit pants already doomed to stains that no dry cleaner could remove. Here, I said, handing him a trowel. Make yourself useful. He smiled. He took the trowel. We weeded together in comfortable silence until he said, Mom, I'm sorry. For all of it, for not asking what you wanted, for assuming we knew best, for making decisions about your life without actually consulting you about your life, I know, I said. It's okay. Is it? I sat back on my heels and looked at him. Really looked. He had gray at his temples now, lines around his eyes that hadn't been there 2 years ago. When had my son gotten so old? When had I gotten so old that my children had become middle-aged? Yes, I said. Because you're here now. Because you're trying. Because you're kneeling in the dirt with me on a Saturday morning when you could be doing anything else. That's all any of us can do. Show up and try and keep trying even when it's hard. He nodded. His eyes were bright. I love you, Mom. I love you too, I said. Even when I don't like you very much. Even when I'm angry about things that can't be changed. Even when the love feels complicated and messy. Especially then. He laughed. It was a real laugh, the kind I hadn't heard from him in years. Unguarded and genuine and full of something like relief. That evening, I sat in my room with the box of unsent letters. I pulled out the thick stack of them, bound with a ribbon that had been my mother's, and I thought about burning them, about throwing them away, about finally mailing them and seeing what would happen. In the end, I did something else entirely. I wrote one more letter, not to my children, to myself. Dear Eleanor, you're sitting on a narrow bed in a room that's still not quite yours after 2 years, though it's becoming more yours by the day. The walls have been painted by memory, the photograph of your wedding day, the postcards from places you've never been but always wanted to go, the children's school pictures that anchor you to a time when they believed you could solve all their problems. On the shelf, there's a vase that Martha brought you last year, flowers that have long since died, but that you keep because it reminds you that people sometimes think of you. You spent 70 years believing that love meant sacrifice, that being a mother meant giving everything until there was nothing left. You gave your youth and your energy and your hopes and your dreams. You gave your husband's unexpected death as a kind of gift, transmuting grief into motion, suffering into strength. You gave and gave and gave, and you believed that if you gave enough, you'd be safe, that your children would owe you something, that love would be returned in kind. You learned painfully that giving everything means losing yourself, that sacrifice doesn't come with a guarantee, that the people we love most can hurt us in ways that feel unforgivable, and then we forgive them anyway, because the alternative is to live in rage forever. But you also learned something else. You learned that you're stronger than you thought, not in the way you thought, not in the way of stoic endurance and silent suffering, but in the way of adaptation, of finding meaning in unexpected places, of creating beauty from the materials at hand. You made friends, real ones. Martha, who tells terrible jokes and brilliant insights in equal measure. Linda, who stopped crying every day at 4 o'clock and started living again. George, who taught you that repetition can be a way of remembering and that telling the same story over and over is just another way of saying I was here, I mattered, witness this. Robert, with his eternal Coltrane, his belief that music is the truest language we have. You built a life that wasn't the life you planned, but it's a life nonetheless. It's full of small victories and daily rituals and moments of genuine connection. It's small and quiet, and nobody will ever write a movie about it, but it's real, and real is what matters. Your children didn't save you. They saved themselves by placing you here, and for a long time you hated them for that. But you've learned, slowly, painfully, that they were drowning, and they did the only thing drowning people know how to do. They threw off the weight that was pulling them under. You hated them for it because you needed them to see you as precious enough to struggle against that weight, but they weren't strong enough, or wise enough, or brave enough. They were just people, and people fail each other all the time. You saved yourself. You saved yourself by deciding not to wait, by choosing to matter in the small, quiet ways that nobody celebrates but everybody needs. You saved yourself by gardening, by reading, by sitting with people in their pain. You saved yourself by refusing to disappear even when disappearing would have been easier. And now, on the other side of that pain, you can tell your children, I'm okay. I'm more than okay. I'm alive. I'm really, genuinely alive in ways I wasn't before. Keep growing. Keep weeding. Keep playing piano badly, and making terrible chess moves, and laughing at George's stories, even though you've heard them 100 times. Keep sitting with Linda while she folds laundry on Thursday afternoons. Keep humming along with Robert's Coltrane. Keep accepting the visitors who come and missing the ones who don't. Keep holding space for grief without letting it consume the space where joy is trying to grow. Keep living. Love, Eleanor. I folded the letter and put it in the box with all the others. Then I closed the box and slid it back under my bed. Someday, maybe my children would find those letters, or maybe they wouldn't. Either way, I'd said what I needed to say, and that was enough. I looked out my window at the garden, at the tomatoes climbing their stakes, heavy with summer growth, at the herbs spilling over the edges of their beds, wild and alive and offering themselves up to be used. The sunset was painting everything gold and rose and orange, colors like hope, colors like beginnings, colors like a story that doesn't end but transforms. Tomorrow, Martha and I would start a new book. Robert wanted to teach me to hum. Jason was bringing his guitar for a Saturday concert. The tomatoes needed picking. Life needed living. And I was here for it. I was really, truly present for it in ways I'd never been present before. For the first time in a year, maybe the first time in my life, I wasn't waiting for something else to happen. I wasn't waiting for my children to validate me. Wasn't waiting for my life to become the life I'd planned. Wasn't waiting for grief to finally release me from its grip. I was just living. It was enough. If this story touched something in you, if it reminded you that there's more than one way to find home, then I want to ask you something. Not as a sales pitch, but as a genuine request. Share this. Not everyone will understand it, but someone will. Someone who needs to remember that the end of one story can be the beginning of another. Someone who needs to know that being sent away doesn't mean being forgotten. Someone who needs to hear that you can forgive without surrendering your truth, that you can love people without needing them to be different, that you can rebuild from ruins. Subscribe to this channel if you want more stories like this. Real ones, messy ones. Stories about ordinary people finding extraordinary courage in small moments. Leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. I want to know how far Eleanor's story travels. I want to know that somewhere, in some city I've never been to, someone heard this and thought, yes, this is true, this matters. Because here's what I've learned. In 72 years of living and 2 years of learning to live again, we don't need perfect families or flawless love or happy endings where nothing hurts. We need honest stories about surviving what hurts. We need to know we're not alone in our pain. We need to remember, every single day, that there's always a way forward. Even when that way is through a garden you didn't plan. Even when home is somewhere you never wanted to be. Even when the people who love you get it wrong. Even when forgiveness feels like the last thing you have left to give. Even then. Especially then. Thank you for listening. Thank you for staying. Thank you for letting Eleanor's story become part of yours. Now go live. Messily. Bravely. Fully. The tomatoes are waiting.